Welcome back to Decolonial View, the podcast where we unpack the ideas shaping how we see the world. I am your host, Professor M.A., and today we are diving into something that sounds a little rebellious: epistemic disobedience. And don't worry, this is not about the breaking the rules for fun. It is about breaking the right rules, especially when those rules decide what counts as knowledge, who gets to produce it, and who voices push to the most. So let's talk the basics. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy overall which studies the knowledge, how we know, what we know. And disobedience is, refusing, obey, literally. But them together, if you put together and you get once introduced by the scholar Walter Mignolo, a Latin American genius, who argues that modern world was built not only through colonialism, land and bodies, but also through a colonialism of knowledge. So what happened during colonization? Eurocentric perspectives were elevated as universal truth, while indigenous, African, Asian, and other known Western ways of knowing were dismissed or totally erased. That is where epistemic disobedience comes in. It is the act of saying world of dominant story is not the only story and is not automatically the most valid one. So it is a challenge to the idea that the knowledge must look, sound, or be framed in Western academic style to be considered legitimate. It invites us to value forms of the knowledge that come from lived experiences, collective memory, spirituality, ecology, and community practices, from forms that often fail outside traditional institutions. The knowledge forms which are not acknowledged by the global north, the knowledge forms were once prevalent and may be dominant in the global south. But here is the key: epistemic disobedience is not just critique, it is creation. It is about building and receiving alternative systems of knowing. It refuses the notion that the West has the final say on rationality, on science, or on truth. Let's take an example. Think about medicine. For centuries, colonial powers labeled traditional healing systems like Ayurvedic, Chinese medicine, indigenous herbal practices as superstition or primitive, even though many of their principles align with the modern evidence-based findings. Epistemic disobedience means recognizing that these systems are not merely cultural artifacts, they are valid and sophisticated bodies of knowledge and that have sustained communities for millennia. I take the example of language. When a community is told that their language is backward or less precise, the underlying message that their thoughts are backward or less precise. Epistemic disobedience pushes back. It says that reclaiming a language is reclaiming a worldview, one that may offer entirely different categories for understanding nature, time, relationships, and identity. And there is a political dimension too. When social movements, black feminist thought, indigenous resistance, queer theory produce frameworks grounded in lived reality, they often find themselves dismissed as not objective. But epistemic disobedience asks, whose objectivity, whose standard, whose worldview shaped the rules of the game? By questioning the gatekeepers of knowledge, marginalized communities create space to articulate truths that have always existed but were systematically ignored. Now, this doesn't mean rejecting science or scholarship. It means recognizing that no knowledge system is neutral and every system has limits. Epistemic disobedience urges us to look at where knowledge comes from, who benefits from its authority, and what gets left. So, what does epistemic disobedience look like in everyday life? It might be a teacher incorporating indigenous ecological wisdom alongside Western environmental science. It might be a writer refusing to translate cultural concepts into Western terms just be marketable. It might be a community using local history, oral tradition, or collective memory as a legitimate structure of truth. Or it might be you choosing to question the assumption that official institutional knowledge is always the most complete. At its heart, epistemic disobedience is an invitation to unlearn, to listen differently, to expand our sense of what counts, and to understand that the world is richer, more complex, and more interconnected than any single perspective can capture. And friends, that is it for today's episode. If this sparked something in you, if it made you curious about these stories, wisdoms, and the knowledge system that live outside the mainstream, I encourage you to keep exploring. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and stay